Welcome to this edition of District Dialogue. I'm Tarenia Carthen, District 3 Commissioner here in Douglas County, and joining me today is a phenomenal woman, Dr. Carol Anderson. Dr. Anderson is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of African American Studies at Emory University, and she is a New York Times best-selling author. And she has written several books that chronicle the history and legacy of slavery, segregation, and now suppression. Her books often deal with the unspoken truths of our nation's divide. One of Dr. Anderson's latest books, One Person, No Vote, gives light to the tactical precision in which voter suppression has set us back decades. Now I'd like to welcome Dr. Anderson.
Thank you so much for having me, Commissioner Carthen. Thank you.
We are entering into very significant and, dare I say, decade-changing decision-making period. For me as a voter and as a local legislator, some of the decisions that I will make in the upcoming months, especially here in October, November, have to deal with uh, redistricting and drawing lines. As you know, that's based on our census. But that also has a lot to do with how the voting lines are drawn. I also have to deal with how do we allocate the dollars that come down federally so that we can get it into our local communities to help the citizens, right? So I grapple with these things. One of the things that I really grapple with is SB 202, which came down during General Assembly in the state of Georgia. And so if you can, help us break down what SB 202 is doing for Georgia and how we can help right the wrongs.
Yes. I would say what it's doing to Georgia and to Georgians and not for Georgia or for Georgians. It is a voter suppression bill that targets the ways that African Americans have accessed the ballot box in 2020, in that historic election where you had massive voter turnout. And it has systematically created obstacles and hurdles to access those methods, such as the absentee balloting, where for 15 years, you didn't have all of those requirements because African Americans and Democrats overwhelmingly did not use absentee ballots. But now in this election, when they did use them, then you had this fear of this language of voter fraud, to say that we've got to bring election integrity. We've got to make sure that the people are voting who they say they are. And so now you've got these identification requirements on absentee ballots. You also have the closure of drop boxes, so in Atlanta, we had 94 during the 2020 election. With SB 202, it goes down to 23. Not only do you have this massive limiting of access to drop boxes, which became really handy for folks who couldn't stand in those long lines. It was a way to provide access to the ballot box that worked with people's lives. They've also moved the ballot boxes behind closed doors. So now they're in buildings. So now they're not outside where they're accessible 24/7, but now they're in buildings that will be closed during a lot of the hours when people are available. They've also eliminated and shut down some access to early voting, particularly for larger counties. Let me back up and put it another way. What they've done is to say that they're being equitable by adding additional hours, but the way that they have defined those hours, it in fact provides the leeway to curtail access to the ballot box for early voting in larger counties like Fulton and like DeKalb. And it has just, not only have they gone after the methods that Black people have used to access the ballot box in 2020, but they've also lowered the guardrails that prevented Trump from overturning the results of the election. those guardrails dealing with that now give the legislature the power to remove county election boards, members of county election boards, and to insert their own election czar in there who will handle the certification of elections. How they remove the Secretary of State's voting power from the state election board. So these things are all designed under the guise of election integrity, are designed to undermine the integrity of our elections.
Absolutely. And all of those things, as a commissioner, I have to say, to me, it doesn't help the voters in my district. It doesn't help the citizens of Georgia, because you've actually taken the power from the citizens of Georgia and you've put it in the hands of very few people, right?
Right.
Because each person's vote should count, right? Nobody's vote should be nullified because of the results don't go away that a certain particular or person or a certain party wants it to go. That's the foundation of democracy. Each person's voice counts, and whoever shows up the most wins. That's just how it is, right? Whoever gives us the best game on that Sunday takes home the spoils, right? They take home the victory. And so when I hear our President Biden, looking to pass jobs and infrastructure bill, I can't help but ask, what about the infrastructure of our democracy?
Mm, exactly. Exactly. And where we're hung up is that we've got a democracy that is not working, that is hanging up the infrastructure of democracy in terms of voting, with HR1, S1, the For the People Act, and with HR4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We're seeing both of those hung up in Congress, although the vast majority of Americans welcome that legislation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Speaking of the vast majority of voters wanting something, the last poll that I saw said the vast majority of voters think that, voter ID is not suppression. As a matter of fact, they welcome voter ID, right? Why wouldn't we, Dr. Anderson, want to have someone show ID just to prove who they are when they show up at the ballot box? Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
I can. There has been a great PR campaign to justify the unjustifiable. The voter ID emerged out of that 2000 election. We remember the debacle in Florida, but we don't recall how horrific it was in St. Louis, Missouri, where the Board of Elections had illegally purged almost 50,000 voters from the rolls. So when those folks showed up to vote, their names weren't on the books. And so the poll workers sent them down to the Board of Election downtown to get it figured out. They're there for hours, for so long that the Democratic Party sued to keep the polls open for additional hours because people wanted to vote and could not for no fault of their own. And the judge agreed, right, that the polls can stay open till 10. The Republicans came in shortly thereafter with a higher court, and that court ruled that the polls had to close. The Republicans argued that the folks in St. Louis were trying to commit massive, rampant voter fraud, that they were trying to steal the election. Senator Kit Bond argued that you had dogs on the rolls voting. You had dead people on the rolls voting. You had people using these addresses from these vacant lots and voting using one address and then coming back and voting using another address. None of that was real, but what they did was they kept saying it over and over and over. That's the power of a lie. And they took that lie into Congress when Congress is crafting the Help America Vote Act to deal with that mess in Florida. Kit Bond brought the lie of massive rampant voter fraud into the halls of Congress. And so in federal law, you see this language of trying to deal with the mess in Florida to reinstill confidence in American people about the quality of our elections, and put it on the same par as the lie of voter fraud. So you get the language in the Help America Vote Act that states can require voter ID. And so what you've got is the lie of massive rampant voter fraud. And what I mean by lie is that Justin Levitt, a law professor out of California, did a study from 2000 to 2014. He found that in 1 billion votes cast in the United States, there were only 31 cases of voter impersonation fraud. 31 out of 1 billion.
That's not even 1%.
Right.
That's not even a fraction.
Right. That's like 0.000000.
Exactly.
Right. But that's the foundation of the lie of massive rampant voter fraud. And that lie is then predicated, that the voter ID is then predicated on that lie. What also makes voter ID so insidious is that it says that it's to deal, that it's a small bit to ask, given the democracy in peril that voter fraud causes. But the way that these legislatures have crafted voter ID, they have looked at racialized data on who has what types of ID, and then privileged the IDs that whites have and made it more difficult for the IDs that Black people have to be eligible to vote. So they've used the IDs as a means for access to the ballot box. So you take Alabama. Alabama said you have to have a government issued photo ID, but then said your public housing ID doesn't count. Does it get more government issued than public housing?
I was about to say, I grew up in public housing, so that is as government as you can get.
Exactly. But 71% of those in public housing in Alabama are African American. And for many of them, it's the only ID that they have. And so when they banned that, then there was, okay, we'll get a driver's license. But then Governor Bentley shut down the departments of motor vehicles in the Black Belt counties, making it so that Black people would have to go 50 miles to get a driver's license to be able to vote. But if you don't have a car, and if you don't have public transportation that can get you over to the next county and back, how are you supposed to get this driver's license that you need to vote? That's the way that it works. That's the shell game that is being played in front of the American people. It is a fraud. It is a hoax. And what voter ID does is it makes it look innocuous. You know, I need my ID to check out a book from the library. Your library card won't count. Right. And so part of what it also doesn't take into account is that for many of these IDs, you need a birth certificate, right? But if you were born in a rural place, in a poor place, and you weren't born in a hospital, you don't have a birth certificate. So what it takes to get a birth certificate, hundreds of dollars in terms of the visits, the trips, the other documentation you have to pull together. So this you create an obstacle, voter ID, and then you have these obstacles to the obstacle that make it doubly difficult for folks to vote. That's what's so insidious about voter ID.
I tell you, just listening to you, I can relate to everything that you're saying, because my grandmother was 85 when President Obama won, and that was her first time voting in her entire life.
Wow.
And I remember when Maynard Jackson ran for City of Atlanta mayor, and my grandmother wanted to vote. And they had voter registration come through where we lived, and we lived in Perry Homes in the center of Atlanta. And she wanted to vote, but because her employer wouldn't let her off early enough to get to the polls, she couldn't vote for Maynard Jackson. And so she was just hoping. She said, I was just hoping and wishing on the way back home, because she never learned how to drive. Therefore, she never had a driver's license. But she was just hoping and wishing that Maynard Jackson got in, that enough people showed up to put him in office, because she couldn't be there to put him in office. And she didn't feel as though she needed to vote again, or she couldn't vote again until President Obama.
Right. And that's the power of these stories. I mean, so what we're hearing here is like the reason why early voting is so important, particularly for working class folk who can't get off on that special Tuesday in November. And we know Atlanta, so that if your job is at Emory and you live in Southwest Atlanta, you can't get because of the traffic from Southwest Atlanta up to Emory in time to be at work at 8 o'clock when the polls open at 7. You can't do that. And so what early voting does is it opens access to the ballot box for more American citizens. This is why you see the targeting at early voting from these legislatures. What they figured out, for instance, is to go after souls to the polls, to shut down that access to voting on that Sunday, because that Sunday has become a time when churches bring their congregations to the polls. And this is why you saw it initially targeted. And then the pushback was intense that caused the Georgia legislature to go, oh sorry. But it was what happened in North Carolina. North Carolina X'd out souls to the polls that Sunday because they had the data on when Black people voted during early voting, and they eliminated those days. And one of those days was the souls to the polls day. And the court, the Fourth Circuit, said, you have, looked at that Xing out the souls to the polls and said, this is as close to a smoking gun as we have ever seen. Now, when the court tells you, whoo, this is a smoking gun, son, you done fired the bullet. That's the, and I think that it was that decision by the federal court in North Carolina, plus the uproar that happened here in Georgia, that caused the Georgia legislature to back off of eliminating souls to the polls.
And I'm so glad that portion of it happened. But I think what people fail to realize, and I've been educating people on this, is that what it takes now to put on the election based on SB 202 will be significantly higher in terms of cost, because you have brought the ballot boxes now inside of, for us, it would be the courthouse and a couple of the early voting precincts, which means you now have to have manpower just to watch that box, right? So that's extra people, right? You now have to have special paper to print the ballots on, right? That's an extra cost, right? You've now had to, because the days have been, the timing has been cut. Okay, so we now have to crowd more people in to get just as many people through. And I'm like, okay, but what if COVID continues? That's not to me, that just didn't seem logical, right? And I said, okay, well, maybe this is not predicated on logic, but what COVID has really showed us is that the health of your system, right, has everything to do with the systems that you hold. And so when this airs, Dr. Anderson, it will be October. And that brings us into some significant awareness months. I'm in the medical field. When I'm not being a commissioner, I do healthcare billing, electronic health record management. So I see a lot of this. And especially in our communities where we have issues of breast cancer awareness, right? In October, we have mental illness awareness happens in October. We also have primary care awareness that happens in October. Now, I can tell you that all of that can be linked to our voting. I can tell you specifically that it can. Now, can I do the research that Dr. Anderson can do to tell you how it links up? No, but I can tell you that if you don't get to the polls and vote, then you will not have people in place that can expand Medicaid and all of those other things that can help with your health, the health of a community.
Absolutely. I mean, so the expansion of Medicaid has been a possibility for well over a decade here in Georgia. And we have had political leadership that has spurned and turned away federal dollars that could have kept access to affordable health care in our rural communities. They could have done that, and they made a conscious decision not to. They made an ideological decision not to. And you begin to think about what that means in the era of COVID. COVID really exposed the healthcare fissures in our communities, the lack of affordable healthcare, the lack of ready access. and the comorbidities, the stuff that we carry in our bodies from diabetes to high blood pressure, and what that means when you've got a virus that is attacking you, how that really sends you spiraling down. We saw that in our communities. And the response, the political response from our leadership was basically bees that way sometimes. They didn't care. They really didn't care. And so how we vote and for whom we vote has a lot to do with the quality of our healthcare, the quality of our communities, the safety and true security in our communities, the health, the vibrancy of our communities. Those policies matter. When you think about how the folks who are attacking our voting rights, how if they cared about what we want, they wouldn't be attacking our basic right to vote. The fact that we're getting an attack on our basic right to vote and having it couched in the language of fraud, which is defining that fraud as coming out of the Black community. I mean, this is what we need to think about. So when they say, yeah, we got to look at Fulton County. Yeah, we've got to look at Atlanta. We've got to look at Detroit. We've got to look at Philadelphia. We've got to look at Milwaukee. What they're saying is that when Black folks vote, there's nothing but fraud. There's nothing but criminality. When that's the framework in which they are operating, the policies emanating out of that framework do enormous damage to the Black community.
Yes. And here's the thing that really gets me. It does damage the Black and brown community, but guess who else it does damage to?
Boom.
Boom. I mean, you if I'm not free, guess what? You're not free and your child's not free. And at some point, that limited mobility and that limited freedom is going to be at your doorstep. And it doesn't make sense to hold me down so that a few can be lifted up.
I mean, this is the inanity, and this is of the work of what I call white supremacy, white rage, is that it targets Black achievement, Black advancement, Black aspirations, but it does so in a policy-wise way to make it look legitimate, like there's something really valuable that's happening here to save democracy, when in fact it's undercutting democracy. But what that means is that you get white people as collateral damage for these policies. During the Jim Crow era, when they went after the right to vote, they specifically said, we are targeting the Negro. But they also were like, and there's some white folks we don't want to vote either. And it got to the point with the combination of the poll tax and the literacy test and the domestic violence that was raining down on these communities, that you would have voter turnout rates in the single digits in federal elections, in the single digits, which meant that you had white folks not voting either. And so the policies that this small strata of folk were making, based on that they only had to be responsive to a small number of people in their constituency, did not improve the quality of life for folks. You saw bad schools across the board. You saw bad roads, bad infrastructure. You saw jobs that didn't pay a living wage. You saw the lack of access to quality health care. All of those policies emanated out of this Jim Crow mindset that had white people as collateral damage.
Wow. And, I know you're talking about the 60s, but why does it sound like you're talking about 2021?
Mark Twain apocryphally may have said, history may not repeat itself, but it sure do rhyme. Okay. And we are listening to the rhymes right now. When we see the lies about massive rampant voter fraud, those were the same lies that they were telling in 1890 in Mississippi as they were recrafting their constitution to figure out how to disfranchise that Black population. When we see no, this isn't racially targeted. It's the same stuff that they said in Mississippi, in Georgia, in Alabama, as the poll tax and the literacy test were coming through. No, this isn't racially targeted. This is just to improve the quality of our democracy, to make sure that our elections are sound. This is the same thing we heard then that we're hearing now. And it has the same underlying root. How do we stop these folks from voting?
And that's the part that I truly don't understand, because as an elected official, and I'm 3 years in now, I don't want to be in a seat that the people didn't put me in. It's not my seat. It's the people's seat, right? And we, the people, know who we want representing us. And at any time they go, Tarenia, it is no longer your seat. We no longer want your representation. I need to step back because the people have spoken. Why won't we allow the people to speak? What makes someone fearful of allowing someone else to come in and see the job that they can do in order to help us all elevate? What is wrong with that?
Well, Paul Weyrich, who was the co-founder of the Heritage Foundation, which is a right-wing foundation, and the co-founder of the American Legislative Exchange Council, which worked to distribute these voter suppression laws throughout the state to the state legislatures. He said in 1980, in a conference, he said, all of you are goo-goos. All of you want this good government because you want everybody to vote. Well, I don't want everybody to vote because, quite candidly, our leverage goes up as the voting populace goes down. And that's the framework, is that our power goes up as we curtail access to the ballot box to millions of American citizens. It is so anti-democratic, and that's democratic with a small d, but that is what is coursing through these voter suppression laws, is our power goes up as the voting populace goes down. We see that with gerrymandering. And extreme partisan gerrymandering is, you talked about what that means in terms of redrawing these district lines every 10 years. When they did it in Wisconsin in 2011, after the 2010 census, the Republicans locked themselves, a small group of Republicans locked themselves in a hotel room for months, redrawing the maps. They had two goals. One was to eliminate the competitive districts, because they knew that with competitive races that people really came out to vote because they're like, my vote matters. But if you eliminate competitive districts, then people have a tendency to stay home. And that's what they wanted, the voting populace to go down. The second piece in their strategy was that regardless of how many votes we get, the Republicans will always have the majority of the power in the legislature. And they drew those maps. They kept drawing those maps using that kind of Cambridge Analytic data about who was where, what people believed in, and kept drawing until they got it just right. In that first election, after these maps were drawn, Democrats received 52% of the vote and only about 38% of the seats. Think about that. 52% of the votes, 38% of the seats.
So they diluted the power,
yes,
just by the stroke of a pen, just by how they drew the lines.
Yes, that's what extreme partisan gerrymandering does. It violates that basic principle of one person, one vote. And generally what it does is it says for our big cities, is that you don't get one person, one vote. The maps are drawn in a way that it dilutes the power of those, the representation power of those who live in the cities, and it elevates the power of those who live in sparsely populated rural areas.
Wow.
Yes.
Sounds like Georgia.
Boom. Boom. Yes.
And I absolutely love my state. I do not like how the legislation comes down and it seems to hammer the very people who have put you in office to do exactly what you know and I know needs to be done, just because you want to hold a seat. And if the truth is really the truth. If you're doing what's right, people gonna keep putting you in there. If you're just doing what's right.
I mean, and so this is why we see these massive disparities in what the polls say that people want. So when you think about it, you had the vast majorities of Americans who wanted access to affordable health care. They wanted they wanted Obamacare. But
Yes.
you had Congress and you had these legislatures who were figuring out how to not provide access to Obamacare to the people who were craving access to quality health care. How do you have that disparity between what meeting the people's needs and what the policies that you're implementing do?
That's right.
That's what the power of gerrymandering and the power of voter suppression can do.
I know we have gone through, periods in our history that says we are still in reconstruction. I think I told you that. I feel like we're still in reconstruction. We're still reconstructing. Every time we feel as though, we make strides. And it's not just for Black and brown people, because the strides that are made on the backs of those who go out and who protest and who say, no, 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 this is wrong. And they keep pushing back and they keep pushing back and they find ways and they find allies to hold people accountable. It seems like every time we do this, SB 202 pops or something else pops up.
Mm-hmm.
But what must we do in order to keep pushing and keep hope alive?
We have to realize that if we don't fight,
Mm-hmm.
it gets worse. If there's not that resistance, if there is not that pushback,
Right.
this mess will just become so deeply embedded that being able to get out of it, being able to see a way out of no way is going to be virtually impossible. It has been that consistent push, that consistent resistance, that consistent hope of what being free really looks like. How you walk free, how you breathe free, how you smell free, how you live free. All of that is absolutely essential in this struggle. When we give up, and let's be clear, Black folks have never just given up. They fought on the slave ships in the Middle Passage, trying to get free. They fought and found ways of resistance during slavery. We know about the slave revolts, but there were these other methods that they used, such as putting rocks in the bags instead of cotton. You want to go sell that rock, you go right ahead. Breaking the tools, right? Black folks have resisted subjugation all along because of imagining what freedom looked like. And it is that imagining and then that working for it that has got us so much closer to from where we were. That's why we fight.
Yes, yes. And here's my thing. I want the space that you occupy, because God put you there. I didn't put you there, right? I didn't have anything to do with the space that you occupy. But I want you to own that space. I want you to occupy that space. I want you to do what God has innately gifted you to do. Because I know once you live, breathe, and do that thing, guess what? Everything else around you will be able to do the same thing, and we will all benefit from it. This is America. You can't have a divided America, but then think democracy or think that you are free or think that things are okay. It doesn't work that way. Fight for others' freedoms, because along that you get yours.
Right. I mean, what Martin Luther King said, we are all in this tapestry of destiny. And I'm paraphrasing, but we are all together in this tapestry. Our destiny is woven together. And we see this. We see this during the civil rights movement. What those battles did was it began to open up America for more people. You saw the LGBTQ movement really just taking off. The women's rights movement taking off.
That's right. That's right.
The American Indian movement taking off. You saw this battle for equality taking off. The farm workers movement really taking off. And it is, and what that does, that empowering, it is that vibrancy of a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy. That's the vision.
Yes.
And we can have that,
Yes,
but it's going to require um, allies. It's going to require us doing the hard lifting of democracy, that heavy lifting of democracy. And it's going to require calling out those who attack and try to undermine democracy. So SB 202, we know it is, technically speaking, a hot mess.
Yes.
Know that what it does is not to provide election integrity, but what it's designed to do is to undermine that integrity.
Yes, yes. Bringing it full circle, my mother passed at 46 from breast cancer, and we were not by any means a well-to-do family. And when she found out, she was on Medicaid, and because of the limited resources had during that time, she couldn't get the type of care that we would have wanted her to receive. Right, right, right. So we know that having people in office, we know that having access to good healthcare providers that you can trust, that look like you, that sound like you, that understand what you're going through, that will go sometimes above and beyond to get you what you need in order for your survival, right? I think if we could just understand that if we do right by one, right? If we do right by one, we'll get somebody to do right by us when it's our time. And there's never not a time when you don't need someone else. There's never not a time when you're going to walk the face of this earth and you're not going to need some support or someone to lean on, right? So
Right.
if we would
Right.
just if there is nothing else that I can say to those who will watch this October, when you hear about all the awarenesses, when you hear it's time to vote, please show up at the polls. Don't get discouraged. Don't take for granted the right that you have, because your voice does matter. And if you don't show up, right, they're going to start writing you off, right?
Right.
So
And
sure.
and the reason they're going after our voices is because our voices do matter. Our
Yes.
votes do matter. We wouldn't see this kind of sustained attack if it didn't.
It did.
Um, and so one of the things is we don't cede our power. Um, I think about the special election in Alabama, the Senate race in 2017, and Alabama had deployed every method of voter suppression against its Black population. And that was the election that had Judge Roy Moore running against Doug Jones.
Doug Jones, right?
Right, right. And all of the polls had Roy Moore, for all of his nastiness, winning that thing. But Black folks mobilized, their civil organizations mobilized, and figured out how to get around, under, and over every method of voter suppression that Alabama had put in its place. And I remember watching the returns come in from that election. And when you're looking at Northern Alabama, it was Roy Moore, Roy Moore, Roy Moore, except for like Huntsville, Roy Moore, and then Selma. And Bernice King tweeted, Selma, Lord Selma. And that, and I went, woo, because that is when you saw this massive Black voter turnout that just began to flip the script on what Alabama could be. And then Birmingham delivered the knockout blow. And wow. And that kept a man who is an avowed racist, who had a legacy of allegations of being a sexual predator. Just
At the malls in the Alabama area, right, where we know our teen girls, frequent and things of that nature.
right. I mean, that kept him from being Senator Roy Moore. And that was Black folks going, not today, Satan, not today. And like I said, Alabama had put every method of voter suppression on Black folk, and they showed up. That's what we do.
One one voice, one vote,
Yes.
right? One voice, one vote, and it makes a difference.
Makes a difference.
Now, before you go, I want you to tell us a little bit about why you chose to name your book um, "No No Vote,
One
One
person,
Voice, No Vote,
one person, no vote.
No Vote."
Yeah. It was because seeing the historical way that, let me back up, that foundationally, we think of democracy as one person, one vote.
Right.
We see that as foundational. And
Yes.
what you see in these voter suppression laws is to make that to turn that on its head, where one person can get no vote. The way that Black folks are targeted, the way that Hispanics are targeted, the ways that Asian American Pacific Islanders are targeted, the way that young people are targeted, and the way that poor people are targeted. It is designed to silence their voices, silence their votes. And so, in this democracy that does this swag thing, we are the world's greatest democracy. We have had a history of undermining American citizens' right to vote. And that was the genesis for One Person, No Vote, as the title of this book.
Well, I just want to say thank you for writing it. Thank you for writing White Rage, which I even had my daughters to read that 4 or 5 years ago before they went into college. So I just want you to know, you have, you don't know this, but in my mind, you're like my silent mentor, right? I look to you to see, okay, should I be thinking this way? Should I be, as upset, as I am? Because oftentimes I can feel the adverse pushback, right? I can feel, that, but oftentimes I can't name it. But then I hear you. I see you, right? I see you on the Trevor Noah show. I see you and I go, that's it. That's it.
Thank you. Uh,
So I just wanted to say thank you, Dr. Anderson, for joining me today, joining the citizens in Douglas County, taking time out of your schedule to spend with me. Currency is a time that when it's spent, you can't get it back. You can't ask for a refund. So I want you to know I am absolutely pleased and honored that you would take this time to spend with me. Thank you so much. And you are welcome to come to Douglas County anytime.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am honored to have been asked to be on your program. I really am. And to spend this time with you. This is so important. Our fight to vote is just, it is the thing that will determine the quality of our lives.
That's right. That's exactly right. Where can my constituents find more about you?
I have a website, professorcarolanderson.org. That kind of lays out my books and my media appearances, and a little about me.
That's
Yeah.
wonderful. Well, again, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much. You too.